I wanted to talk about method, and I tried writing several versions of the paper until it dawned on me that the reason that I was finding it difficult was because I hadn't really made up my mind about this topic. So what I would like to share with you today are my current thoughts about method, what it means, and its role in the process. I'm used to talking about method in the context of research, so research methods, but it's also occurred to me recently that perhaps there's less difference than one might think between research methods and the methods of professional practice. So, maybe at the end we can exchange ideas about how all of this should shake down. One of the reasons for talking about method is it's amongst the two, as I call them, nuclear weapon questions or issues in doctoral research. If you ask a student or even a supervisor about research methods, it usually induces a kind of instant panic and paralysis, if not instant death. And it seems to me, having met this many times over, that perhaps this is just something that we don't understand very well, particularly not in creative areas. Mostly I work in visual arts, but I also work with architects. I've never worked with poets or literary people before, so that's very interesting for me to hear opinions from people who use words all the time, rather than people for whom words are often strangers. But it's one of two terrible things that you can do to a student, is to ask about method. At the end, if you're still curious, you can ask me what the other nuclear weapon question is. But let's see if I can say something about what I currently think is method, what it means. For me, it's something simple. I want to demystify this. So method is simply something that you do. It's an activity. Actually, action is the word that I prefer to use at the moment. So, for example, you might interview somebody, or you might make a painting, or you might write a poem. This has potential to be a method because it's an action, it's something that you're doing. And in the academic field, some of these methods have become so formalised that we have names for them. For example, conversation analysis, the method that has a name. Now, I think this is very misleading because it can encourage us to think that if our method doesn't have a name, then perhaps it isn't really a bona fide method. So we should be aware that there's more than one method out there. Some of them have names, but some of them don't. Some of them are used in combination. And if we look at other disciplines, we can have the misleading impression that they've got it all sorted out because they know how all these methods fit together and which one to use at any one moment, like going to the supermarket and knowing what to take off the shelf. But when you start to look at method, you'll find that there's a horrible plurality of methods. If you go to the methodology section in the library, it doesn't really help you. After a while, the advantages of all of those named methods get lost in the simple abundance of how many methods there are, of how many different things you could do. So you're faced with an issue, and you could write a poem, you could interview people, you could count things, you could set up an experiment. There's an endless list of the things that you could do. So how could we deal with this plurality? Well, I think that takes us into the territory that, again, is often overlooked, I think, in accounting for these things to doctoral students. And that's the relation of method and methodology. They're not the same thing. A method is an action. It's a thing that you do. But it's only meaningful or appropriate to the task at hand within a methodology in which there are a system of actions that are interrelated that would help us to understand something in the way that we're interested in. So, if I were interested in poetry, you might criticise me if as a researcher my first thing to do was to count the number of vowels that there were in a poem. And you might say, well, why are you doing that? Now, of course, I might have a perfectly good answer to that. Or it may be that I'm just trying to look as though I know what I'm doing. So I'm pretending to be a researcher by doing something scientific, like counting things and weighing things and stuff like that. But probably that's not going to be very relevant. So the methodology is the set of beliefs in which particular actions are going to be appropriate. So a form of critical interpretation might be more what you would expect rather than some form of quantitative analysis. Although, of course, there are branches of poetry that deal perhaps more with numbers than with the traditional values of poetry that we might associate from times past. So methodology, what I'm trying to get through here, methodology is a set of beliefs that make methods meaningful. And if you choose the wrong, if you're operating in a different methodology, what you are doing will seem meaningless to the people around you. Now that only gets us so far because, as you might expect, there's just a horrible number of methodologies as well. That doesn't really answer our question, I don't think, but it at least explains the fact that certain actions have got value in a broader context, and these are not really up to us to mix and match. Certain things are going to make sense, and certain things are not going to make sense. So we can start to limit the number of methods that we think are available to us according to our stated position of what it is we're trying to do and the belief sets we're evoking. So we're beginning to make a bit of headway in this madness. This is the madness of the title. Now, just to show that this is not a new phenomenon, I think this is a very nice representation of the whole messy business. So, although Raphael has painted this splendidly classic representation of the school at Athens, central figures here being Plato here and Aristotle here, this sums it all up. Because if you look closely, you'll see they're pointing at different things. They're pointing in different directions. Plato, this one in the red, is pointing upwards. Plato's system of belief is that if we really want to find out what things are like, we need to look, well, upwards is a bit of a metaphor. We need to look inside. We need to use our mind. We certainly don't need to be distracted by all of the things out there in the world. We need to resort to our inner resources and to, if you like, to the purity of heaven. Aristotle, on the other hand, the guy in blue, is making a gesture. I mean, people have talked about what is this gesture. It looks a little bit as though he's making a gesture like this. Broadly including all of the world that's around us, all of the people who are jostling for position in this school of Athens. So Aristotle's view is that if you really want to know what the world is about, you should look at the world about you. These are two totally opposite views of what we should do. Two different methodologies, if you like. And according to the belief set of each, they look in totally different directions. They use totally different resources. Plato, for example, perhaps would prefer to sit in a darkened room, whereas Aristotle perhaps would like to go out into the broad sunshine. And so on. We can unpack this as much as we want to. But it's been there right from the beginning. And these two guys were contemporaries. Plato was the teacher of Aristotle. So it's not as though one methodology is replaced by another. No, they all go on simultaneously, but you've got to know where you are in order to know what to do. So, let me go back to where I kind of normally start in order to try and unpack this a little bit further. Normally when we talk about research and the objectives of research, before we get into which methods would be appropriate, we clarify that research is an activity that's going to take us from one state to another. So the part of that I wish to emphasize is the intentional, the directed part, the fact that there is transformation, change. But this needs to be a change that's recognised to our community. So we need to adopt a methodology that will make people think, yes, now I'm wiser about this issue. I have insight that I didn't have before. Somehow something has changed, rather than just people thinking, what? Now, because we have to speak the language of our community, because we have to somehow take an issue forwards or make a contribution to an issue, I think there's a relationship between the question, take the word question, by the way, broadly, this could be, issue, topic, theme, and the response that we make to this question. So the relevance is that there's some kind of connection. If I'm interested in poetry, there's some kind of poetry-related outcome that's coming out of it. It isn't that I come out at the end of my research process with a vaccine for influenza. I come out of it with something to do with poetry. It relates to where I started from. This begins to tell us a bit, I think, about the range of methods, and indeed the whole belief set, the methodology, that underlies our process. Now, we're doing all of this in an academic context. So, although we might be tempted to make some, let's say, Dadaist response to our issue and say, ha, there we go, that's my contribution. The academic context, particularly for the award of a doctorate, there's an additional layer of expectation here, isn't it? You've got to talk an academic language. You've got to, in some way, perhaps demonstrate the way in which you moved from position A to position B. So there are several different objectives and expectations at play at the same time in these activities, especially in the academic context. But the academic context isn't the only one that we're trying to satisfy. There's a broader social context. When at a parochial level, the academic funding probably comes from taxpayers, and so the ordinary person has got a certain amount of investment in the things that we're doing. But there are a number of different games going on here. Even if we thought academically it would be valid to hold this whole symposium in Disneyland, Florida, on expenses, there perhaps are social constraints on what we're doing. So there are perceptions of what is legitimate academic research as a whole. And then there are perceptions within academia of what is legitimate within humanities, within poetry, or within a particular discipline of poetry or painting, whatever it's going to be. So this sets up an enormous number of constraints. So what the picture I'm trying to paint here is that although we felt, perhaps, that we had an infinite number of methods, an infinite number of actions that we could have undertaken, and that there were an infinite number of methodologies, an infinite number of belief sets in which we could validate what we were doing, there are forces coming in from the outside that say, well, no, you haven't really got complete mental freedom here. There are certain expectations and roles that need to be undertaken by the participants. One of the big constraints upon this, I think, is to account for whatever it is that we're doing. So it isn't enough simply to lay it out on the table and go, ta-da, and think that the work has spoken for itself, that the move from position A to position B is self-evident. I think there is still an expectation, perhaps this is the academic square, the academic rectangle that surrounded us in the previous diagram. Perhaps it's the social one, I'm not quite sure. But to be able to account, to be able to track back and say, okay, so why did you do that? So why did you do that? So why are you saying it cost $1 million and I've got to pay it? And that's to do with a model that we have from both Aristotle and Plato. And that is, with a combination of evidence and argument, we can uncover something. We can uncover the truth, perhaps, but that's kind of, we had that conversation earlier about. We can pick that up again. That's a word I'm not going to use. We're not going to talk about the truth. So here we are, trying to find out what's the truth. But in a courtroom, all that we actually decide at the end is, well, this person is responsible. This person is guilty. We don't necessarily know that that really happened. There's a basis of probability, perhaps. The evidence points towards this. The argument made in court on the day was so and so. And of course, periodically, the whodunit conclusion is overturned by appeal and so on. So it's a less certain process than we think. And what I would like you to take away from that is that although Aristotle and Plato were arguing in entirely opposite directions, I think they were both using this kind of system. Plato wasn't appealing to physical evidence in the world. He didn't care about the bloody handprint. But nonetheless, he could give reasons for the steps in his argument. If you read the dialogues, it's pretty clear how the argument is going, although perhaps the appeals are to what one must think, what one must conclude, what one already knows, rather than to a bit of empirical evidence. So there's a strong tradition that perhaps everybody's buying into, either in the social context or in the academic context, that this is going to get us further down the line than other methodologies. So there's a evidence and argument assumption going on. And I wonder whether that really helps us very much, whether that's really true in creative arts, in literature, if we're asking ourselves, well, what's research like? Or what's advanced professional practice like? How do we produce new things? What's the process? What's the method at work in producing them new? And I think we have to recognise there are a lot of different contexts here, and really only one of them contains that kind of evidence and argument assumption that I drew from the courtroom. That in the art gallery, we're not really concerned necessarily with that kind of linear account, this explanation of where the artwork came from. Indeed, most artists would resist that very much, that somehow the work is explained by what it's made of, how big it is, when you made it, stuff like that. That's not really what it's about. That's not its creative provenance. Those are incidental to its meaning. So I guess I'm saying that perhaps academic research, doctorates and so on, have selectively chosen one or two things that have got a lot of intellectual pedigree, academic pedigree, and overlooked some of these other contexts in which one might come to very different conclusions about what constitutes a legitimate process. And I'm moving towards the idea that we need an activity theory for research. What would that mean? That means that we need, in order to understand better what the processes are, we need to look at what people actually do, and we need to look at, a little bit like anthropologists might, look at the social and cultural conditions in which something is recognised as research and in which something is not recognised as research, or recognised as innovative creative practice, or not so recognised. Academically, we've got some things that stand in the way of getting a clear view of that. We've got things like institutional regulations that make it clear that obviously it's a PhD if you've got an 80,000 word thesis, and obviously it's not if you haven't written it yet. But I'd like to just say, well, why? What's the role of that in the process? What would it be like if we didn't have that? I'm not advocating we get rid of it altogether. I'm not doing that. I want to ask the question, why? Why do we do that? And perhaps it's to differentiate research from professional practice. That might be one objective. That would be a legitimate objective. That professional practitioners, they just write poems and publish them. They just make paintings and stick them in the gallery. Whereas academics write a thesis about what it is that they're doing, and that's what makes them academics. That might be true. But in which case, that's really what's meaningful in this process, isn't it? That we have a socially recognised context both within academia and more broadly in society, in which you can call yourself an academic or a researcher or doctor, whoever it is, if you have written about what it is you've also done. And that would apply to a scientist as well. You get a PhD in science for writing about what it is you've done. So my invitation is to go back to some of these things, something like Tracy Emin's Bed in his poem, that are recognised as, or validated, let's say, as contemporary acts in their genre, in visual art and poetry, and see, well, how's this working? Who's making these decisions? How is that decision mobilised within the community itself and within these larger contexts in which they're sometimes perceived? And of course, sometimes we see this breaking down. We read in the newspapers, for example, this isn't art, this isn't poetry, shouldn't be allowed, shouldn't be in the collection, shouldn't pay taxpayers, shouldn't spend taxpayers' money on it, shouldn't put it in front of students. So there's not always agreement about these things. But I suppose I'm saying that the core part to pay attention to is the process of validation, rather than thinking, aha, what makes this into an artwork is that it's made of certain durable materials. That means that it can be transported around and shown in various galleries. Or some problem, I'm not going to even try to talk about what makes them into poetry, not in the present company. But trying to find objective features, perhaps, in the work itself, rather than seeing this as a symptom of a social organisation in which we have a category of artists and poets and so on. So in my activity theory of research, the place to look is at this intersection. I'm saying we can't only look at it in isolation, so we can't do a kind of rational analysis of the nature of questions and the nature of answers, and therefore the nature of methods that take us from one to the other. We have to look at the whole thing within these broader contexts and say, this is a social activity that people are doing. People are playing at being researchers. They're doing research. And the ones who are not being pilloried for it are the ones that those social groups recognise and authorise and validate in this activity. So it's a consensual process. It's not something objectively owned and held and commanded by the researcher or their supervisor. Jen may hate me for saying some of these things. I don't know if this is undermining some of the things that you want to do with it. So I think what matters here is whether you are being a poet or being a poetry researcher rather than the product itself. It's an activity. It goes on in these intersecting contexts that determine what you're able to do. So within the smallest rectangle, we've got poetry, what it is to be a contemporary poet. I guess if you were to write poetry like Tennyson and you did it today and you were to put that forward as sort of avant-garde practice, people may say to you, well, unless you're going to tell me I'm missing something here, this has been done before, this is not especially relevant to today's conditions, doesn't reflect some of our post-colonial feminist, whatever, views that are current for us, and therefore this work does not really resonate with contemporary society as contemporary production. So there are some things that you could do that might have once been perfectly okay for you to be a poet or a poetry researcher, that no longer are adequate and in the future will also change. So this model has the benefit of explaining why it is that these things are not fixed. After all, if writing poetry were a fixed thing, there'd be a kind of fixed formula for doing it, same way there would be for painting. That's not the case. The reason it's difficult to say what makes contemporary art is because it's not something that is located entirely within the realm of art. It's to do with its resonance for society as well. And then we've got academia, and you'll see that being a poetry researcher means that we do fall within the environment of academia, but we could be a poet and not be an academia. So these contexts, all the rectangles are contexts. They don't necessarily all apply to us, all apply to us at the moment, all apply to us here. But nonetheless, that's where the conditions come from as to whether it is we are allowed to say that we are being a poet or being a poetry researcher. This also explains how it is that we might falsely think we were being a poet, and actually everybody else thinks, well, no, that's nonsense, or that's not very valuable, or you're deluded, or you should be locked up. You know, Foucault's theory of poetry would fall in here quite nicely, I think. Getting kind of towards the end, I think. I'm just reinforcing again something I've done already, that these are social activities. They're not going to be defined or clarified by looking within the realm of poetry alone. The poetry, writing poetry and being a poet researcher is a social activity. It's a game that we play, a social role that we have. There should be some pictures here. Oh yeah, there we go. So your methodology is where you stand. It's the embodiment that you have. It's the attitude that you have towards the world. It's what you think when you get out of bed in the morning. And I'm reckoning these two guys think differently when they get out of bed in the morning. So what it is they're engaging with and how best to deal with that. And so I think we see methodology more in terms of the relationship we have to the outside world, and including all of the other people who are in it as part of our context. That will clarify a little bit what makes a methodology, and hence what methods are appropriate to what it is that we're doing. So we look outwards at who else is out there and how threatening they look, rather than inwards as to what's the nature of poetry, what's the essence of painting, in order that we could change that and take it forward.